All we've heard about earth and creation and this question we had this morning, it will come as no surprise to you that the scripture story for today is the story, one of the stories that Genesis tells us about the creation of the world, of the people and the things, and how God fashioned it all. And so I'm going to invite Greg to come forward and read that for us. And as he does, this is a little longer because it took a couple days for God to do all this. And so I'd like to invite you to simply listen carefully. This is a slightly different translation than you may have heard before. You might want to close your eyes if you're comfortable doing that, but just listen carefully to the beauty of this creation story as we hear it.
Genesis 1 through 2:4. In the beginning, to create the heavens and the earth was chaos and emptiness, and darkness came over the face of the deep, yet the Spirit of God was brooding over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Light be," and light was. God saw that light was good, and God separated light from darkness. God called the light day, and darkness night. Evening came, and morning followed, the first day. Then God said, "Now make an expanse between the waters, separate water from water." So it was. God made the expanse and separated the water above the expanse from the water below it. God called the expanse sky. Evening came, and morning followed, the second day. Then God said, "Waters under the sky be gathered into one place, dry ground appear." God called the dry ground earth, and the gathering of the waters sea. And God saw that this was good. Then God said, "Earth, produce vegetation, plants that scatter their own seeds, and every kind of fruit tree that bears fruit with its own seed in it." So it was. The earth brought forth every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit with its seed in it. And God saw that this was good. Evening came, and morning followed, the third day. Then God said, "Now let there be lights in the expanse of the sky. Separate day from the night. Let them mark the signs and seasons, days and years, and serve as luminaries in the sky, shedding light on earth." So it was. God made the two great lights, the greater one to illuminate the day, and the lesser to illuminate the night. Then God made the stars as well, placing them in the expanse of the sky to shed light on the earth, to govern both day and night, and separate light from darkness. And God saw that this was good. Evening came, and morning followed, the fourth day. God then said, "Waters swarm with an abundance of living beings. Birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the sky." And so it was. God created sea monsters and all sorts of swimming creatures with which the waters are filled, and all kinds of birds. God saw that this was good and blessed them, saying, "Bear fruit, increase your numbers, and fill the waters of the sea. Birds abound on the earth." Evening came, and morning followed, the fifth day. Then God said, "Earth, bring forth all kinds of living souls, cattle, things that crawl, and wild animals of all kinds." So it was. God made all kinds of wild animals and cattle and everything that crawls on the ground. And God saw that this was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, to be like us. Let them be stewards of the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, the wild animals, and everything that crawls on the ground." And so humankind was created as God's reflection. In the divine image, God created them. Female and male. God made them. God blessed them and said, "Bear fruit, increase your numbers, and fill the earth, and be responsible for it. Watch over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and all living things on the earth." God then told them, "Look, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit carries its seed in itself. They will be your food. And to all the animals of the earth, and the birds of the air, and things that crawl on the ground, everything that has a living soul in it, I give all the green plants for food." So it was. God looked at all of this creation and proclaimed that this was good, very good. Evening came and morning followed, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and earth and all their array were completed. On the seventh day, God had finished all the work of the creation, and so, on that seventh day, God rested. God blessed the seventh day and called it sacred, because on it God rested from all the work of creation. These are the generations of the heavens and earth when they were created.
Thanks, Greg. So, did anything stand out to you from that particular story? Anyone want to share a word or a thought or an image that came into your mind as you were hearing that? And the beauty of the sunshine. Levi. Everything was good. Yeah, everything is good. Over and over again, God says, "This is good." Yeah. Yeah. God gathers things, puts them in place. It's like a great Play-Doh, you know. You're like pushing things away, and yeah. I have a small child, so Play-Doh comes to mind.
Be responsible for all things.
Yeah. Be responsible for it. How are we doing? No. Yeah. Well, if this summer we are about the work of learning to love the stories that the Bible tells us, among other stories, but beginning with those, then it makes sense to tell the very first story that the Bible ever tells about what happened in beginning to create things. But before we go delve more into that story, I want to tell you another creation story. By any chance, when Sean asked this morning for you to think about a different creation story, did anyone come up with the Babylonian creation myth? $1 million. No, okay. Megan did. All right. Woohoo. That's right. Good. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about this. And here's why this matters. No one can know for sure. There's so much we can't know about who and when, who wrote parts of the Bible and when it was written. But sometimes we know something. And biblical scholars believe that this first chapter of Genesis, what Greg just read for us, was most likely written during a really awful hard time for the people of Israel. And that is, namely, when they were in exile in the land of Babylon. So about 600 years before Jesus was born, roughly the year 587 BCE, the city of Jerusalem and its surrounding country were conquered by the Babylonian Empire. It was a practice of the time, when you conquered a land, to take the best of the people. So the scientists and the leaders and the political people and the wealthy and the educated, and drag them off, take them away from their land and bring them back to yours. So you took away the strength of the land you had conquered, and you tried to keep it for yourself. And so that's what Babylon did. They dragged off the artists and the scholars and the scientists and the wealthy people, and they brought them to Babylon. And there, those folks lived in exile for about 50 years. Some of them, as was the hope of the victors, some of them would, of course, marry into Babylonian families, and that they'd never be heard from again. They assimilated into that culture. Others held on to their identity as people of Israel, people of God, and hoped and hoped and hoped and prayed that someday they would get to go home. And meanwhile, back home in Jerusalem, people hoped and hoped and hoped that someday those people they loved would come back. Exile was cruel but effective, which is sort of a human specialty, isn't it? During the 50 or so years that those folks were in exile in Babylon, they would have gotten to know that land well. I mean, think about yourself when you move to a new place. You come to know over time the cultures there, the traditions, the morals, the expectations, and the stories. So, one of the stories that those people of Israel would have heard was the creation story of that culture, of Babylon. It's called the Enuma Elish, which is just the first two words of the story. And I'll tell you a little bit of it. It's long and complicated, and there isn't even time to tell the whole thing now, nor do I think I could get all the details right. But to give you a kind of the big picture of it, the Babylonian creation story starts not with the creation of the earth or people or birds or skies, but the creation of the gods. Over time, generation after generation of gods come to be. And from the beginning, there is conflict between and among these gods. As the conflict gets worse and worse and worse, the sort of final straw is that the youngest generation of gods is accused of partying too much and keeping the old gods awake all night. I am not making that up. That is like the final straw. And so these gods begin to murder each other. A grandson kills his grandfather. Our mother raises up an army to kill one of her children. And finally, the god Marduk kills this matriarchal god, Tiamat. And after he vanquishes her, he creates the earth, fashions the earth from her body, from the pieces of her body. Once that's done, as a symbol of victory, Marduk then makes human beings to be the slaves of the gods. That's their job. The gods know that work needs to get done in the universe, but they don't want to do it. So Marduk makes the human beings to do all the work. That's what they're created for. And thus endeth the story. It's beautiful, isn't it? So that's the story that the exiles from Israel would have heard. The story that the culture around them was telling about where things came from and why things are the way they are. You can hear in that story that it's very much about power and control. It's a story that tells you that earth was born out of violence and struggle and conflict and death. And human beings are made to be the slaves and sort of playthings of argumentative, destructive gods. So how would you think of yourself if that's the story you heard about where you came from? How would you think of the earth, or your role in it, or your neighbor? How would your hopes and dreams for your life or your community be shaped by that? If you must, as one writer says, if you have to have a carcass to create a cosmos, I just loved that phrase. You have to have a carcass to create a cosmos. If the world around you is born out of bloodshed and murder, if the story tells you in no uncertain terms that you are built to be enslaved and that rebellion against that power will cost you everything, then how will you understand your life and who you are? Well, those ancient exiled Israelites heard that story. And somewhere in them, something in them said, I think there's a different story. I don't think that's it. They began perhaps to remember the ancient words of Israel, the creeds, the songs, the poems that told them that the God they worshiped was a God of steadfast love, slow to anger, abounding in mercy, seeking for justice, ready to forgive. And so they slowly, carefully began to weave a different story. And maybe they whispered it to each other when they passed on the streets or told it to their children at night. In beginning to create the heavens and the earth, they said, there was chaos and messiness, and things were not together the way they should be. And God looked at all of this brokenness and said, I think there's something here. They told a story about a God who created not out of violence, but with words. A God who brought order into chaos and put things where they belonged. who looked at creation with joy and said over and over again, this is good. Even a God who treated the creation itself like a sort of companion. A God who would say to the earth, now, earth, make birds. And then it did. Birds, make more birds. Seas, make fish. Trees, make plants. Make seeds, make fruit. And then finally, a God who created human beings not as slaves or playthings, but as partners. God said, here you go. I give this to you. Now your job is to take care of it and keep it going. Make more. For in you, the world will see my image. And then the very last thing these people said, these exiles said, the very last thing God made at the pinnacle of all of it was rest. Rest for everything. Rest even for the land and for the animals and the seas and the light and the sky. And at the end of it all, God said, this is holy. This is very good. This is very good. Now, how would you understand your life and yourself and your neighbor and the earth if that was the story you heard? Would it be a little different than your Babylonian neighbors, maybe? We 20th, 21st century people have spent, or let me just be clear, wasted a lot of time arguing about how scientific this Genesis story is. About how to define 7 days, or how to cram an ancient story into a modern scientific context. But when we do that, we are really missing what's at the heart of this story. Because the deepest truth of this story is not just explaining what happened a long time ago. The deepest truth of this story wants to tell us who we are. The same thing those ancient Israelites were wondering, who they were and who they were called to be. There's so little we share in common with the ancient people anymore. Our lives are so different, but there is this, that we too, like those folks in Babylon, are caught between competing stories that tell us who we are and who we ought to be. Are we consumers? Meant to buy and use and buy more and cross our fingers that there will be enough later on? Are we achievers, driven to determine who we are by how high up we are in the ladder? Feeling better by the number of people we've passed by? Are we conquerors? Forever trying to prove how right we are, how good we are, how inside the group we are, finding our identity against others, insisting that we have to win and be first no matter the cost? Are we survivors, just here to scratch out the best living we can for ourselves and our own families, all pitted against each other in some sort of awful contest to the end? Are we nothing? As perhaps unhealthy people or even our own families might have told us at some point, something so wrong about us that we don't even deserve to be? Those stories that we hear, maybe from a very young age, can shape us. They do shape us, sometimes in beautiful or even awful ways. They can leave us with very deep scars. The stories we tell about who we are and where we come from, they matter. They matter all the time because they shape how we understand our neighbors, the people sitting next to us, the earth that we live on, and the relationships we make. So this isn't just about some dusty old story that ancient people told thousands of years ago. This is a story about us and who we are together as a community and as individuals in our own lives. In that way, Genesis is gospel in the truest, oldest sense of that word. Good news is what the word gospel means. And it's good news because it tells us about a God who creates out of love, for the sake of love, not for or out of violence or conflict. A God who creates not to conquer things, but to share them, not to enslave, but to empower. And getting ourselves into an argument about how many days that took is, let me be clear, the dumbest thing we can do with this story. Because the story is not about a long time ago. The story is about us. Someone once wrote that this story of creation, that writing this down and telling this particular story in the midst of the Babylonian Empire was humanity's first act of nonviolent protest. I think that is the best way to understand the Genesis story. It is humanity's first act of nonviolent protest. A poetic and beautiful story told by a small group of seemingly powerless people caught in a system beyond their control, who yet had the strength to imagine a different hope, a different vision, a different way of understanding the world and each other. And for that reason, this story still matters, because we are still called to do that very same thing, to tell a different story, to live a different story, to see our neighbors as partners, not competitors, to see the earth as the object of our care, that for which we're responsible, not something to be abused. To look for how God has infused this world with good, with joy and generosity, not with fear or scarcity or falsehood. Those are the values that this story gives us. And it's no coincidence that those are the values we hold together at Salt House and that we're called to hold in our own lives. Because when this story of abundance and joy and divinity is infused in us, if that's the song we hear in our heads, then we cannot help but live differently and act differently and treat this world differently. So now I want you to get that brick back out again. You knew it was coming at some point. And I want you to look at that word or phrase or picture whatever you did earlier. That was something that expressed your beginnings, who you are, the things that are at the center of you. Maybe that word or image comes from a place within you, a brokenness that God can fashion into something new. Maybe it's expressing a joy that you hold in your life these days. Or maybe it expresses some chaos and messiness, and you are still waiting for the Holy Spirit to come and brood over that and create new life. Whatever that word or phrase is, I want you to find a different side of the brick, whichever one you want. And now, listen for a word or a picture, an image, something that expresses your hopes and dreams and prayers, not just inward but outward. That is for your community, for Salt House, or for the world. Because this story of joy and generosity and creation is not something we keep to ourselves, but something we live out. As it shapes us, we begin to live differently. And so I want you to think of something, a word, again, image, whatever it is, phrase, couple of words, that expresses that outward prayer, hope, for this community of Salt House and for the world. As you hear the music in a little bit, I want you to pray and listen and then write that word or image when you're ready. You can put it down when you're done and trust that in a little bit we'll build something out of that. So as we begin that, please join me in prayer. God of life, God of water and wind and light and darkness, God who knows chaos and brokenness and moves among it all, form us, shape us, call us out of our fear, our anxiety, our clutching to things that only separate us from one another. Be again whom you have always been, a God of freedom and joy, of connection and creation. Make us each day in your image and teach us to breathe in your spirit of life. Amen.